Shut up, stop, trust me, listen to this intro. It's going to make all the difference in the world. In this video, you're going to learn everything you need to know to get started making games in Unity with PlayMaker. I'm going to show you the minimum viable understanding. This is like showing you how to walk and use your hands so you can eventually figure out more advanced things on your own, like running or picking things up, so you can then decide whether you want to build a house or a chair or a swing set or a bow and arrow, whatever. It is much more important that you get started and do things in stupid, inefficient ways so you can have a fundamental understanding of how not to do things. And this will be backed by experience. I'm not asking you to reinvent all the wheels. I'm not asking you to throw away the decades of design philosophy built by your predecessors. I'm asking that you trust that you're only going to know which questions to ask once you've jumped in and just made stuff. This is about keeping you engaged, giving you incremental rewards for learning little new things over time, giving your brain little crack nuggets to stay hooked on GameDev. There's definitely some dark analogies in here about trying to do one big crack rock your first time or whatever. So I'll let your imagination figure out why smaller and spread out over time is better. So yeah, you get my point. Let's move on. What I want you to do is just watch this video first. Don't follow along with your own project. Just watch it because it's going to go by quick. And even though you will definitely not remember everything, you'll be left with an overview and impression that's sort of ingrained on your subconscious, right? You have to kind of know what's possible first. And that'll be very handy when you get around to opening up Unity yourself, and when you're following along in tutorials, and when you're browsing forums and manuals for answers. Okay? Let's go. So here's the Unity Hub once you have it downloaded. When you have this projects button selected, it'll show you all the projects. If you're just starting, you don't have any projects in here, there's nothing new to make, so you can hit this new project button. When you're making a new project, this is what it's going to show you. These are project templates, so whichever one of these you select will change how your project is set up when you create it. There's only one major fundamental difference in all of these, which is what kind of render pipeline it's on. So URP stands for Universal Render Pipeline, and HDRP stands for High Definition Render Pipeline. You'll see that over here on the side it says SRP, and that means Scriptable Render Pipeline. So URP and HDRP are an SRP. This is the category, and these are the two options. The reason these are here is because Unity used to just have one way of rendering things, and then they announced this URP and HDRP. So Unity just wants to make sure that you know the difference between the old way of rendering things and these two new ways of rendering things. The main difference between these two is that URP is going to be much faster, it's much more lightweight. In fact, it used to be called the lightweight render pipeline. And HDRP is going to include a lot more fancy features, a lot more customizability, but URP comes working right out of the box and requires less effort from you. HDRP, there's a lot of things that you have to set up yourself and do a little bit more upfront work to make things work. I would highly recommend you start with the URP if you're just starting out, just so you can learn things. Most projects are probably good to use URP. Now, the other thing is that do you do 2D or 3D? And you have 2D URP, and you have all these other 3D or 2D versions, right? Even though they're saying that there's 3D and 2D and all this other stuff, actually under the hood, they're going to give you the same thing. It just means that all these projects are going to have the same features. It just means that when the project starts, a bunch of the settings are going to be tweaked so that developing a game in that format is already ready. If you start a 2D project, you can easily tweak some of the settings and make a 3D game. And if you start a 3D project, you can easily tweak some of the settings and make a 2D game. So the ones that are this light gray color, you'll be able to start with. And if you want any of these other ones, they have a little download button next to them, then you're going to have to download it first. So I'm going to select this 3D URP. I'm going to hit download template. Once that's ready, it'll ask me to name my project. So in here, I'm just going to call this Stephen Scott Day Games. This is asking me where it wants to save the project. I like to save it here in my GitHub folder. That's where I put all my projects, so later on I can make repositories. It's very smart to make repositories. Okay, so this is the name of my project. I'm going to go ahead and hit create project. So over here on the right-hand side, you'll see I have all these projects with different editor versions. This is 2021, 2022, 2020, even a 2019 down here. The thing is, Unity changes some major systems over time, but most of the systems inside of these projects are going to be the same. So if you're ever watching a tutorial or reading a manual or whatever it is, and whatever it's explaining doesn't seem to be appearing in your project, just make sure that you're on the same project that the tutorial or manual or whatever is explaining. Okay, if you want to download a specific version, you can come over here to installs. Here's all the ones that I currently have installed, but you can also hit this install editor and look for official releases. So these are the old ones that Unity totally supports right now. And then over here in the archive, you can come over here and go to the download archive if you really wanted a super specific version. I'm going to be making a project today in version 2021.3.23F1. When you're starting a new Unity project, it's going to take a while to build, but after the first time you wait for this, opening your Unity project will actually be much faster. It's just when you create a new one that it takes this long. Okay, so this is the first thing that you should see when Unity opens, as long as you use the same project template type that I chose, but more or less you'll be seeing the same thing. There's a lot going on here, but we could break it down into a few simple tabs that makes this a lot more readable. See all these different tabs here? Each of these is a tab, right? You have this. All of these are tabs, and you could click and hold these and it'll undock them, and you can snap them to a new position if you want, or you can completely undock them so they're floating around like this, okay? And you dock them back like this. So the first thing I want to show you is down here, this project tab, okay? So here in the project window, this shows you all of the files that make up your project. All of these little folders here and all the little files here in the project tab, these all are directly correlated to files that are actually on your computer. So if I right click on this assets folder and go to show in Explorer, or if you're on a Mac, show in Finder, it brings up that corresponding folder in your files. Okay, so you can see that, remember I put it in that GitHub folder, and there's the project name, Steven Scott Day Games. So when you create the project, it's actually just creating a folder with that project name that you set. And then inside of it, it puts all of these files. Now there's tons of files in here, but all you really need to worry about most of the time is your assets folder. So that's why down here, if I close this, come back over here, you'll see that we really only have these two folders here that show up. Okay, so assets is where you're going to be putting most of your game stuff. That's like your models, your sprite sheets, your sound effects, your scripts, everything. This is where all your files and folders go. The next thing I want to show you is the difference between scene view. This is your scene view here, this big window, you see it says scene, and game view. Game view, it kind of looks similar, right? Look back and forth between these two. What I'm going to do is I'm going to undock game by clicking and holding it, and I'm going to put it right here. So I put them side by side. This is a pretty common workflow to have your scene view by your game view, but be careful because it takes a little bit more power from your computer because it's rendering things twice. In scene view, this is where you can sort of navigate and move around and look around your game world in any which way you want and sort of see all the little behind the scenes components, and it gives you what we call the editor view or debug view, which shows all the components that make it more easy to navigate your world that the players don't need to see in game view, because in game view, this is just what the camera sees. This is what you're going to see in the final game. This is what the players see. So all these sort of little tools and stuff, like this little sun here, this little camera icon, and the lines around this box and everything, all of that gets hidden for the player because they don't need any of that stuff. Those icons right here are just for you as the designer to make the development process easier and more human readable. Okay, so this game view, what it's actually rendering right now is from this camera. If I select over here with this main camera. So this main camera, if I just delete it, I'm gonna hit delete on my keyboard, see it says no cameras rendering. Okay, I'm gonna put that back. Okay, I'm gonna show you how to navigate the scene view really quick. So I'm holding right click, and that lets me look around. Okay, I could look up and down and left and right, and this is just like a first person camera controller. Okay, with right click held, I can use WASD to move around also like a first person controller. Okay, so this is definitely one of the easiest ways to navigate, but you can also navigate with your clicking down your mouse button, your middle mouse. Okay, this is for panning. So if I move my mouse to the left, it moves the camera to the right. And if I move my mouse to the right, it moves to the left, okay? It's just like a touch screen, okay? It's kind of like I'm dragging up and dragging down. Okay, so this is moving on two axes. And then I can also scrolling down makes me zoom out, and scrolling up makes me zoom in. So that's how you at least move around. That's how you get around in your scene view. You cannot do that over here. Over here is just showing the camera. Over here, there's no moving around unless you have a player controller set up, and that's actually a part of your game. So remember when I selected that main camera, right? So it's right here. This little section right here is called the hierarchy. See this tab up here, hierarchy? With the main camera selected, you can see it's also selected in our scene view, right? So if I zoom out, we have a few things here. We have our main camera, directional light, and global volume. And you can see that when I select it in the hierarchy, it also gets selected in our scene view. So whenever you select something over here in your hierarchy, you can see where it is in the game world. Everything here in the hierarchy has a position in the game world. And also this works backwards. If I select this little camera, it'll select it in my hierarchy. If I select this little cube, it selects this global volume. If I select this little sun, it selects my directional light. Okay, so all of these right here are game objects. Game objects are all the things in your game. So your player controller, the trees in the game, the NPCs, the bullets, your pause menu, all that will have a corresponding game object over here in your hierarchy. So you can create them by right-clicking here in your hierarchy, and you can see all these options for things to create here. You can create a 3D object like a cube, sphere, capsule, blah, blah, blah. And you can also create effects, right? So you can create particle systems and lines. You can create lights, so it's a directional light, a point light, or a spotlight, audio sources, a video player, UI elements, volumes, which are sort of spaces which will render different effects for the camera. And you can create a camera, because maybe you want multiple cameras in your game. And up here, this is a really important one, create empty. So I'm gonna create an empty really quick. When you create it by default, just names it game object. And if I select it, you can see it's right here in the center, right? If I select my global volume, this, okay, you can see that now our game object is here. And I can name it whatever I want. So with it selected, I'm gonna hit F2, and I'm gonna call it my game object, whatever I want. And if I press Control D, I could just duplicate that a bunch of times, and now I have a bunch of these. So hierarchy, the reason we call it that is because there is actually some dimensionality in this list. What you could do is you could take these game objects, and if I click and drag it and I put it on one of them, right? See how this one's highlighted gray now? And if I let go, you could see that it gets added right underneath it, but now off to the side. And now when I move this one comes with it. If I move this into the middle here, game object 9 comes with it. So this one right here, this game object 9, the one that's indented a little bit, it is considered a child of this one. And this is considered a parent of this one. So this, if I rename it to parent, and this one to child. Okay, you'll see that when I move it around, it goes with it. Okay, it's all relative. And I can even put this one in here. And this process is called nesting. Okay, so this parent is nested underneath here, and this child is nested under parent. Okay, so I can keep doing that, and I could add as many layers as I want, right? And it'll always come with it. Okay, so when I select these things, you see how it has these arrows over here? That's because right now I currently have this move tool activated. So up here I have a toolbar that lets me pan around. So this is like a camera move. I have my move tool, which lets me move game objects. So if whatever game object I have selected, I can move it around like this, selecting each one of these arrows to move it up and down, left and right, pretty self-explanatory. And then this rotate button, I could take things and rotate them. It's kind of harder to see right now because these empty game objects, there's no representation that really make any sense. But if I come over here and right click and add a cube, with this cube, if I rotate this, it's a little bit more apparent. Okay, so we're moving it around, rotating it. So these move tools and rotate tools and all these are bound to keys too. So W is move. If you hit W on your keyboard, it's move. If you hit E, it's rotate. And if you hit R, it's scale. So you can also scale things. So each of these will scale it independently on independent axes, except if you get this middle box here, it scales it uniformly. So it's all the same size and it doesn't get stretched and warped all weird. So what I want you to realize is that if I rotate this and kind of make it off center like that, that when I move it, you'll see that even the move tools are also oriented with it. Okay, so this is it sort of moving forward is like relative, and moving down is relative, and moving left and right is relative to the game object itself. That's because currently I'm in local mode. I have local selected here. I'm in this local move mode. I've chose local as the space to move in. See how it has a check mark. But if I hit global, you'll see that this move tool changes, because now global, what that means is the sort of universal up. That means that our tool will match this up here, which is sort of the true up, right? That's actually up and that's actually down. Okay, so global will move in respect to that. Okay, and it also does it with rotation. Okay, so this cube, if I right click on it and go 3D object sphere, it makes a sphere as a child of it. So if I move this sphere out a little bit, let's say like right in front of it, right? Now when I move this cube, you'll see that the sphere comes with it. Okay, so not only do things move around with each other here if they're a child, if they have a parent-child relationship, right? Because we move it anywhere in here and they come with each other, but also in three-dimensional space, wherever they are in the game scene, the child objects will follow the parent objects. Now, you can always select the child objects independently and move it relative, okay? Because they can be independent like that. But again, moving the parent, they're still moving relative to the parent. The next thing I want to show you is over here, this tab right here, the inspector. Now, the inspector lets you inspect these game objects. So when I select any of these game object, over here, this changes. all these little things kind of change. Some of these have different items on them. So you see the main camera game object has a camera component and an audio listener component and a universal additional camera data script component. And then directional light has a light component, and this also another data script component. The global volume has a volume component. These empties that I made, they have nothing except this transform component. That's because every single game object that you put in the 3D space will have a transform component. You can't remove this. So these components, you can move them up and down, right? I could put this like right here, or I could put this audio listener between them. I'm just clicking and dragging. They have to land on that little blue line when you're dragging them around. It has to be perfectly on that line. Okay, but this camera component gives this main camera game object the functionality of a camera. Okay, I could come over here and create a new empty, and I'll call it my own camera. And with it selected, I can come over and hit this add component button and type in camera and add it. Now this game object is also a camera. Now I have two cameras in my scene. This one and my own camera, okay? I'm gonna delete this one. So the thing is, when you wanna add components, you hit this add component button and you type in whatever you want, or you can come over here and browse through all the different types of components. This is a super deep well. I'm not gonna go over all the things in here, but the idea is that every component that you put on a game object gives that game object some type of new functionality. One of the more popular ones, if I select our cube, is a collider. Now the cube has a box collider because, well, boxes are cubes and that makes sense. And then if I click on our sphere here, it says it has a sphere collider because duh, right? So what colliders are, if you see there's this green outline, it doesn't quite match our sphere because our sphere is like sort of inheriting all those changes in size that I made to it earlier, right? See, they even change in scale together. That's how deep that parent-child relationship goes, okay? But if I take the sphere out and I go ahead and right click on transform and hit reset, you can see that the sphere is just fine, right? So the sphere, you see this green line around it, right? This green line around it is the collider, the sphere collider. So if I turn this on and off, you could see it either gets dim or bright. Okay, when it's off, it's dim. When it's bright, it's on. And that just means whether or not it's actually working and actually doing its thing. If you want it to stop doing whatever it does, you just uncheck that box and this thing is like it's not even there. What a collider is a way of checking whether things are sort of touching each other. In game engines, you need to simulate physics, right? Whether or not things are touching each other. And we do that with colliders. So you can also go ahead and create a cube right here, right? And I'll just unparent that. I'll move it right here. The green lines around the cube, as soon as the sphere is intersecting with them, like right now it is, right? We could do stuff with this box collider to say like, hey, you're either intersecting, that means you're inside of it. They just know whether or not they're sort of touching or intersecting. This is definitely one of the most common components that you're gonna be using. And then the other thing that really kind of brings them together, if I add a component and I type in rigid body kind of gives it all of the sort of detailed physics afterwards. Without the rigid body, these just sort of float in space, but they could just register whether or not they're touching each other or whatever. But now if I take this cube and like I flatten it out and I make it extra wide and I move it down like this and I take this ball and I give the ball a rigid body as well. So now the ball has a rigid body. If I take this cube, I'm just gonna tell it not to use gravity and that it's kinematic. Don't worry about that. I'm gonna take this sphere and when I press play, you can see that this ball now has gravity on it. Try to pick it up and it drops. Okay, I can move it up more. Take this ground, duplicate it, move it up, rotate it, put it like this, put the ball right here, hit play. There we go, and the ball rolls off. Another super common component, if I come over here and add 3D object capsule, right? So we have our little capsule here. We can add to this, add component, nav mesh agent. This nav mesh agent component is also really common because we use this for NPCs. This is what makes little characters know how to navigate the world. So if you have a little town with buildings and trees and stuff, it's like, how does it know where not to bump into things, right? Like, for example, right here, you don't want it to bump into here. If you tell it go from this corner to this corner, it should be able to decide for itself, like, oh, I'm gonna try to go like right here, but this stuff's in the way. And you want it to be able to go around things. So if there's a big tree in the center, it should walk from right here, go around it, and then continue on its path. Nav mesh agents are a super common component. You'll probably be using that a lot too. You can see these other components up here, mesh renderer, right? And mesh filter. So mesh renderer is the thing that even lets us see this capsule here. So if I deselect this, you can see that it becomes invisible. Note that the collider is still there, but the visual representation of our capsule is gone. That's what this mesh renderer is. And if I scroll down here to the bottom, you can see that it has this material here, right? It just has this gray material, and that's why everything here is gray. But if I come into my project right here, and if I right click and I say create, I say material, and I'll just say this is my material, okay? And I drag it onto my capsule here, okay? Now my capsule has that material property, right? So my material, with it selected, over here in the inspector, you could see what makes up this material, all the settings, and you can see that basically it's saying, just make things white. Material is what you put on things to give them their textures, to give them their color, to give them all of their sort of visual properties, whether or not they glow, everything like that. So if I change the color of this to red, you can see that my capsule turns red. And now I could use this in other places as well. I can make everything red. All right, so that's a bunch of 3D world stuff. Let's come over here back to the hierarchy. I'm gonna right click, I'm gonna say UI, and then canvas. So a canvas is gonna be the thing that stores all of the information about our 2D interaction, all of our buttons, all of our on-screen text, main menu and pause menu, all that kind of stuff. So with the canvas created, there's currently nothing in it, but you can see it kind of gets added here to the world. There's this giant thing over here. Don't worry, it doesn't actually render like that in the game. It's not like your player is gonna bump into this giant canvas. Again, this is just the editor, so it's the visual representation that helps us, the developers, navigate the engine. Players don't see it like this. They see it on screen the way it's meant to be. Okay, so under a canvas though, you add things to it. So if I right click on it and I go to UI, depending on which version you're on, you might have these legacy options, which are to add a text button or a drop down or input field. I'm just gonna show you that really quick just in case you're on an old one. But if you hit button, it adds a button to the scene. So you can see this game object right here, button, legacy. And you see over here in our game view that there's a button now on screen. Okay, and if I hit play, I can click this button. It doesn't do anything, but there's some sort of basic setup so that the button at least changes color, right, when we click it. So I'm just gonna delete that, selecting it, hitting delete. And now I'm gonna right click on the canvas, UI, and instead of adding a legacy thing, if you are on these newer versions or the version that I'm on, you can say button text mesh pro. And first it's gonna ask you to import text mesh pro. Why Unity doesn't just ship with this already added and already imported and all that, I don't know. Nevertheless, we're just gonna hit import text mesh pro. Okay, now it's imported and we added a button. It's better in a few different ways. You wanna use text mesh pro more often than not. Okay, so now we have a button, works here the same way, right? And if I right click on canvas and I go to UI and I say toggle, it'll add this toggle game object now too. And the thing is, if you wanna move these things around, if you have to select them, right? And you can see over here in our scene view that this is where they are. And now you can move them around, right? And they move around on the game screen in the same way we move them around in the scene view. So a quick way to navigate your scene, by the way, is to select things and hit F, and that'll focus in on them, right? So if I select the button and I put my mouse over here in scene view, hit F, it focuses on it. If I hit F again, it zooms in. You can hit F back and forth and it'll kind of get a close view of it or it'll get a wide view of it. Okay, so canvas, that's where you add all these sort of things. You could just add text, right? So this one, just new text. You can add a slider, all sorts of stuff. You can see all these have the arrow next to them. That means they have a child. There's something nested underneath them. So for this button, if I hit this little arrow, you can see that there's a Text Mesh Pro text game object under here. And that's just the text part of the button. So if I delete it, you'll see that there's still a button, but no text, right? And if I select this text part, I can come over here and you see in the component, there's a field for that text. So I can put whatever I want, okay? And it's the same thing with all of these, okay? You could see that they have children and that they have additional game objects under here and they all have their own components. All these components are what make all the complexities of your UI elements, okay? Now, another thing about game objects, remember I showed you earlier that these check marks, they say whether or not a thing is running or not, right? Well, up here, there's sort of like a master check mark for each game object. So game objects can be deactivated and activated. So for example, this canvas, if I uncheck this, it just turns off all of these. And you'll see that actually they're all grayed out now. And so right now, it's as if they're not even in the scene. Okay, and I can turn it back on like that. I'm gonna keep it off just to keep things clear right now. So the next thing I wanna show you actually wouldn't make much sense unless I first showed you this, which is the Unity Asset Store. You've probably heard of this, but in case you haven't, the Unity Asset Store is a website where people make components and systems and assets for game development in Unity and then host them here so you could buy them and for some of them even get for free. They always have a ton of deals going on, and seriously, like, this is one of the strongest points of using a game engine like Unity because of the marketplace. You have these categories right here: 3D, 2D, tools, audio, VFX, templates, add-ons, essentials. And so any one of these, let's say, for example, PlayMaker. So if I open this, add it to your cart, you download it, you made a Unity account, all that, blah, 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 right? So once you download it, this will turn into a button that says open in Unity. And essentially what's happening is that all of these products here, all these systems and all these assets, they are all considered packages. Every product page has all these buttons right here. Next to overview, we have package content, okay? And this is just everything that comes with this download. Obviously, you know about this because you're watching this because you probably have PlayMaker and that's what you're using all this for. So now that we know that, let me show you how to import packages in Unity. So the first way is up here in Assets, and you could just import package and then custom package. This is if you have the file on your computer already. So say, for example, you bought PlayMaker directly from Huton Games and they emailed you a download link and now you have this package. This is where you would import it from. Okay, you would find that package file on your computer and you hit open and you continue from there. From that point on, the process will be the same as this next way that I'm going to show you, which is by coming up to Window, Package Manager. And the package manager is a way of showing you all the packages that are in your project and all the packages available in other sort of ways. So up here, this little drop-down menu, you can show My Assets, which is basically all the assets that you've downloaded to your account in the asset store, and the built-in ones. So remember we imported TextMesh Pro? There it is. Okay, that's the package that we're currently using. But I'm going to change this one to My Assets. And these are all the assets that I've downloaded on my account. Now, this isn't all of them. If I hit load, it'll load more, and now this is all of them. But what I want to do is load and select PlayMaker. Okay, so PlayMaker is the one that we're going to import right now. So I'm going to hit import. Now I've already downloaded it, so it says re-download for me, but you'll have a download button first because you need the initial download. But once it is finished downloading, you'll have this import button. So I'm going to hit that import button, and this shows you all the files that are going to come with it. This is the package right here. These are all the files. Okay, so looks good to me. Now I can hit import. Okay, and now all those are imported. So if that was a bunch of 3D models, they would just be ready to go. They'd be just a bunch of files in these folders down here. And for plenty of other different type of assets and tools and stuff, it might just be ready to go. But with PlayMaker, it's a little different because PlayMaker has a very interconnected way with working in Unity. It's a whole interface edition. It's a whole system that's being added. It's a ton of programming components. So PlayMaker needs to be installed. Okay, so we're gonna hit install PlayMaker first. And I'm gonna hit install right here. This is just a little warning that says make a backup, because when you're messing with packages, sometimes files can get overwritten, files can get deleted, files can get changed or moved around or whatever, and that could affect fundamentally the way your project is built. And sometimes that can screw things up. When you're installing PlayMaker, most of the time you're fine. And because this is a totally new project right now, I'm definitely fine. So I'm gonna go ahead and click this button so it can just continue. Okay, so now there's all these additional things coming in. See all this stuff? These are all actions. I'll tell you about that in a second, but it's just a ton more stuff. So now I'm gonna hit import. Okay, so that's like the last step in this process, is it just says, hey, we have a bunch of extra stuff and a bunch of extra things that this needs to run. Okay, now that it's all done, we could close this and close this. And the way we know PlayMaker is fully installed and ready to go is that up here, we have a little button for it now. Okay, this PlayMaker drop-down window is our confirmation that it's installed. We're gonna open the two main windows that PlayMaker uses. First, we're gonna come up to here to PlayMaker and go to PlayMaker Editor. By the way, I'm gonna uncheck this little show at startup so this doesn't keep popping up when we change things, so I'm gonna close it now. Okay, but here's the PlayMaker Editor, this window right here. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this tab and I'm gonna dock it right here. This is where I like to put it. Sometimes I merge it with these. Okay, so this is your editor. Now the other one, if I come up to PlayMaker, Editor Windows, Action Browser. Okay, so this is our Action Browser. This is sort of the library of programming. Okay, and I'm gonna put this one right here, okay, next to our editor. So these two right here, you have the PlayMaker editor and the PlayMaker action browser. These are the two main things that you're going to be using most of the time when you're programming with PlayMaker. Now there's one other thing that you're going to be using a lot, but not necessarily. It's just highly recommended. Come up here to PlayMaker, you go to add-ons, download add-ons, and in here you have all these different packages that we could use with PlayMaker, but this first one is what I'm talking about, the ecosystem browser. So I'm going to click that. The ecosystem browser is an archive of additional components that you could download for PlayMaker. So I highly recommend getting that as soon as you can when you start a project. I always get it whenever I start a project. Not gonna get it right now, so we can just get on with things. So we have our PlayMaker editor window and we have our action browser. Now, what does any of this even do? How do you actually make something with PlayMaker? The core component for PlayMaker is called an FSM, and it's something that you put on game objects. So all these game objects right here, right? If you were learning C#, you'd go to add component, and then you could go to new script, and you could name the name of your script, and then it'll create a C# script that you could then add code into, right? With PlayMaker, you go to add component, type in FSM, and you have this PlayMaker FSM. So I'm gonna add that. So now this game object right here has a PlayMaker FSM on it. FSM stands for finite state machine. That means its current state of being, like a light is either in the on state or the off state, it can only be in one of those states at a time. So it's a finite state machine. You put all your programming in this thing, and all the programming happens down here. This is your PlayMaker editor. So this right here is displaying what's inside of this FSM. So if I also go in here and create a 3D object, cube, okay, and if I focus in on that cube, I can rename it, hitting F2, I'm gonna say my programmable cube. I can add component, but I can also right click and add the FSM. So now you can see it has an FSM on it, and you could name the FSMs. You could say like, this is for my character movement, right? And you might want to add another FSM, and you say this is for my character's health, and this one is for specifically for jumping, etc., etc. So you might have all these different FSMs for the different parts of your programming. And if it was an NPC, you might have one that's specifically for dialogue, and you could remove them like this, just remove, 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 right? And if this was a bomb, then you would just add like an FSM that's just called like bomb. And that's just, this would add all the programming for the explosion and the damage it deals and all that kind of stuff. But right now we're just gonna use this to have some examples in it. Okay, up here you can see it says the name of the game object and the FSM. Right here you can see that it says start, and then it goes state 1. So this is a state. And if I right click and I say add state, that's another state, and add state. So we have 3 states in here. An FSM can only be at one of these at a time. So when you want this to do something, for example, we have state 1 here. Right now it's only gonna go to state 1. I'm just gonna delete the rest of these states. We have state 1. If we want it to do something, we give it actions. So remember I have the action browser over here? Well, what I could do is I could type in translate. Okay, see this translate action here? I can select it and I could drag and drop it in here. So now this state has the translate action. If I create a new state over here, this state doesn't have anything. See this area? It's empty. State 2, right, is empty. State 1, see, state 1 has the translate action. Okay, so over here shows you what's inside of your selected state. This translate action, you can see over here it has a description of it. It says translates a game object, which means, which is just a fancy way of saying moves a game object. It says uses a vector3 variable and our blah, 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 right? What I'm gonna do right now is see its y-axis, this green arrow, right? Our y-axis, the little y right there. If I change this y value, I'm gonna hit this little equals button and I change this to 3. Now when I hit play, it starts moving up, okay? Bye-bye. And if I hit -3, it starts coming back down. There it goes. Okay, now I can come over here and put in a rotate action. Put this in here. I'm gonna get rid of this translate, so now it's just rotating. And I'll say that on its Y, I'll rotate it 45 degrees per second. I hit play. There we go. Now we just have a cube that rotates. I can hit -45. And let's add it to its x-axis as well. Now it's spinning right there. And on its z as well, let's do 100. Okay, so now it's spinning on all these axes. So remember, I hit this little equals button right here, right? So I can enter something, because before it looked like this. You see it's this little drop-down menu. And this little drop-down menu says new variable or new global variable. So variables are everything. You use them everywhere. You use them all the time. And they're a way of making it so that, right now, if I just had it like this, 3, that number's fixed forever. I typed that in and now it's gonna be like that forever. There's no changing it. I just hard-coded it, hand-coded it. This is not dynamic. This is a static value. It stays that way. But if I choose a variable, so I go new variable, and it tells me to name the variable, I'll call this rotation speed. Okay, you can name that whatever you want, by the way. I just happen to name it that because that's nice and clear. And I put it all as one word with a capital S because that's nice and legible. But I could have named it Steven for all I care. Okay, so rotation speed, it says 0 over here, right? So when I hit play, it's not rotating, it's just staying still. But you'll see that this variables tab, if I stop this, if I go over to the variables tab and I select my rotation speed, down here it has a value. And here's where I could put something like 45. Okay, so now back in my state, if I press play, you'll see that it says 45 down here now, right? And now you'll see that it moves at 45 units. Okay, now why would you do this? Why not just hand code it in? Well, now with a variable, you can programmatically change this value. So you could pick up a boost that changes this number. It says, hey, the boost says, hey, rotation speed. It knows to look for the rotation speed. And it says, change your speed to like 100 or something. And so it'll get changed to 100 and then it'll move faster, right? So this is a dynamic value now. That's what variables are. Variables are just little containers for values that could be changed. Okay, I'm gonna stop this. Okay, I'm gonna give you another example. There's another one, int add, okay? I'm gonna put this one in here. So int variable, we'll make a new variable called my favorite number. It's gonna add 0. So, I mean, obviously, what do you think? It's gonna be 0, right? It's 0 already, it's gonna add 0, 0 is gonna happen. So, but if I put 5, add 5 to it, press play, it adds 5, okay? And it has this little button here that says every frame. If I hit that, this is gonna execute every frame. So I hit play, look at that. Look at that thing rising, hundreds already, thousands. Okay, it's adding 5 every frame, right? And the amount of frames is dependent on how fast your computer is. So I hit stats up here, and 100 plus frames per second. So this thing just keeps adding 5 some 100 times a second. Okay, so I'm gonna stop this. All right, so every frame is a way of telling this thing to do the same thing constantly. And without every frame, it just means do it once. Another one is select random string. Okay, so we'll make a variable, we'll call it new variable. We'll call it like, I don't know, some random name. And this says that we could set 3 different strings. Strings are just text values. That's all it is. Letters and numbers and characters. So the string value I could say is Josh, and then we can have Andrew, and then we can have like Skippy, but with a dollar sign, and with 9s for the P and Y, like that. So so select random string. You can see over here in the description it says select a random strings from an array of strings. Okay, so when I hit play, there, it randomly chose Andrew. Okay, if I stop it and hit play again, now it picked Josh. Okay, so that's what actions do. They could change variables and they could do all sorts of cool stuff like that. Now let's go to the variables tab really quick. I'm gonna show you all the variables that we can make. So right here, we have floats, ints, bools, game objects, string, blah, 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 right? We already have a float here, right? A float is a number that we can separate with a decimal. Doesn't have to be, but 45, right, can also be 45.789456, okay? So this lets us get super granular and lets us set super precise values like that. That's what floats are for. And then we also have an int, which is an integer. And that one, no decimal, right? So if I try to put 5.5, it doesn't even let me put the point in here. It just lets me type in numbers like that. And I can't type in letters because when I hit enter, it just puts in a number value instead. And then string, we just learned that, right? The value can be anything you want it to be, like that. That's what a string value is right here. A bool is another really important one. We're gonna make a bool, we'll call it my bool. And for bools, that's just true or false, 0 or 1, right? And the value here, it's either on or off, okay? And that is a visual representation. What's really happening behind the scenes is it's just setting a 0 for off or 1 for on, okay? So that's a bool. That's like light is on, right? So the light's on, lights off, lights on, lights off. Game object, right? So you could say my favorite shape, right? And then you can, you know, come over here and grab a cube. My favorite shape is the cube. And now this is a reference to that cube. Now we could target that cube or this sphere. Okay, now this is a variable that references that sphere. All right, now we got vector 2, screen position, because your screen is two-dimensional, X and Y. You use a lot of vector 2s when you're making 2D games. So X-axis, right, left and right, Y-axis, up and down, X positive 5, Y positive 10 would look something like this, right? It's like X positive 5 is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then 10 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's like whoosh, whoosh, right here. And then vector 3 is, guess what? Just guess. It's 3 values, this time for X, Y, and Z. So you use this a lot for 3-dimensional programming, right? So making your characters move around in the scene, making anything move around in the scene, if it's 3D, is gonna be using vector 3s. And we have color, so this is like, yeah, my character color. You can just change this from red, blah, blah, blah. It's just a color value. Rect, this is for width and height and X and Y. So this is used for a lot of 2D stuff as well, a lot of user interface, a lot of UI things. So user interfaces, it's telling buttons and stuff like that, what size they should be and where they should be. Material, my material. Remember I made that material earlier? Well, you could make that into a variable as well. So you could change materials on the fly. Maybe we want the material for this kind of shiny red thing over here to change to like a flat matte blue, right? So that could be dynamic as well. We'll make a texture, my texture, same thing right here. Sprites, user interfaces use sprites, but a lot of 2D games, of course, use sprites. Audio clip, self-explanatory, just a sound file. Quaternion, this is a different one. This gives you the same values as a vector 3, except it's calculated a little differently depending on what you're trying to do with these 3 values. You got an object. Now this one is very vague and generic, okay? Because object kind of means anything in Unity. When I made that, it asks me to set the object type first, right? Before we can set the value, we have to check the object type. So could say broadly object and then somehow store it in there. But when you click on this opens up the menu that shows you all the object types. So it's like you can make an FSM, you can make a Text Mesh Pro component. Remember all these components over here? All of these are somewhere in this menu. All this mesh render, box collider, blah, 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 all that stuff, it's somewhere in here. So if you went to Unity Engine, there's our box collider. So you could set a box collider variable. Okay, so I could store this specific one in here, and then later on I could tell Unity to turn it off and turn it back on and stuff like that. But again, really, it's for kind of anything. Then we have arrays. Now, arrays are super important. This is something that you're gonna be using a lot as well. If you're not using arrays, then you are, I don't know, I was gonna say made Flappy Bird, but I feel like Flappy Bird might even use arrays. Yeah, you should probably be using arrays if you're building anything. An array is a list of things. So you could say like, my favorite game objects. It's an array of floats. So you can see right here it says array type, right? And if I select this, it gives me all the variables all over again. Because an array, all it really is a list of variables. It's a list of values. So if I say game object and I say the size is 3, then I could drag and drop 3 of these in here. But if it's a bool array and I say it's, size 10, then it's like this one's true, that one's false, this one's true, this one's true, and these last 2 are true. Okay, so that's my array of bool values. Seriously, get used to using arrays. They're very powerful. All right, and lastly, we have an enum. Enums are something I don't use very often, but you might be using them. They're good for like days of the week. This is the classic example. So an enum type, you have to set. You have to build an enum first. There's a little editor that PlayMaker comes with that lets you build enums. Enums are basically lists of values that you could read as text. So it's like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, but like human readable text. But they have corresponding integers to them. So like 0, 1, 2, 3. So like if your list was Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, you see Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, but what the computer sees is 0, 1, 2. And that way, when you're creating these lists and stuff, The computer can kind of process it faster because it's easier to process numbers faster than it is to process strings of text. And also there's some sort of like safety things that it kind of helps out with, because if you ever misspell Wednesday when you're trying to program something and all the other programs are looking for Wednesday spelled correctly, but this one time you spelt it W-E-N-D, then that part of your system is going to break. It's not going to, it's like, where is this thing? Where is this thing? But with enums, it's like little drop down menus that lets you just click the item itself, so there's no misspelling things, and it's kind of like a little built-in safety feature. I can't make one here. I have to go to the editor to make one. I have to go to a special PlayMaker window up here to make it. So we're gonna skip that right now. Now, so we have states, right? So far, I've only been showing you stuff that happens in one state. What if you wanted to go from one state to another? Well, that's where events and transitions come in. So I'm gonna put in a wait action. Okay, so this wait action, all it does is it waits 1 second, and then it sends an event. Okay, so this says right here, this finish event. This finish event will send off once 1 second is up. Right now, if I don't set anything and I just hit play, you see that green line that went up? It went too fast. You can't even see it. So I have to put like 3, or let's put like 5 seconds. Press play again. Okay, but look at that. See the little green line? It's waiting 5 seconds. 5 seconds is elapsing. And then when it's done, turns gray. It's done. It's done doing its thing. Now, there was no event, so nothing happened. It just waited here. But if I added a finish event, if I click on this and I say new event, I'm gonna call this next. You can name this whatever you want. Again, it's just about human readability, whatever helps you understand your programming. I'm gonna create this event, okay? And it says event not used by this state or any global transition. What it's saying is that this event needs a corresponding transition. Events and transitions are linked to each other, and they're linked by their shared name. So this next event can't do anything right now. If I press play it again, this would still again do the same thing, nothing. But if I come over here and right click and I add a transition, next, if I add this, it'll let me do something. But instead of having to come over here and right click and add transition next, I can also just click this. I get it for free right here. So click to add transition to state. So I'm gonna click this, and there we go. It added the next transition. Now you see that we still have a little red exclamation mark over here. That's because right now, again, this would still do nothing if I hit play. We added the transition, but this transition doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't do anything. So I hit play, again, nothing. But if I click on this next part, right, and I click and hold, see now I'm pulling a little arrow out of it. And this is your transition. Now I could point to another state. So I'm going to point to this state. I have to put my mouse on the state itself, and you'll see that the arrow snaps to it, and I let go. Now this next transition connects state 1 to state 2. So now when I press play, when this wait action is done, it's going to send the event called next, which has the corresponding next transition, and sends to state 2. You see that? It was highlighted green over here, and now we're in this one. Whichever state is highlighted green is whatever state this FSM is currently in. Just so you can see this in action, I'm going to change it to 1, and I'm going to just copy paste this in the other state, and I'm going to add this, and I'm just going to send back and forth. Okay, so just so you can see it in action. All right, it just waits 1 second and it goes back and forth. You see that? How even the transition arrow highlights green? Okay, so that's how you get back and forth between states with events and transitions. Let's go over here to the first state. Let's put in another wait. And let's say that this first one waits 5 seconds and this first one waits 3 seconds. So the one that waits 5 sends the next event, right? But let's say that the one that waits 3 seconds, let's make it a new event called me first. And let's add that transition, right? So add transition down here. If I select it and I pull out this arrow, right? Where am I gonna go? I don't wanna connect it to state 2 again. Instead, I'm gonna hold Control, or that's Command on a Mac, and I'm gonna let go of click, okay? So that creates a new state automatically. With this state selected, you can name these states, state 1, state 2, and all that. So state 1 will leave, state 2 is like waited 5 seconds, right? That's this one. When it's done, when it sends next, it'll go to this state. That means it waited 5 seconds. But in this one, that means it waited 3 seconds. And we'll even put this wait action in here too, just so we could see this thing constantly going back and forth. Okay, so the thing is you have 2 wait actions competing here. One takes 5 seconds, one takes 3 seconds, and of course, duh, I mean, if you're not following along already, come on. So, see this one's going faster, and of course it gets there first, okay? See, and this is just never gonna go to that state, because right now we have programmed it so that one takes 3 seconds to send an event, and the other one takes 5, so every single time, if we let this run for the rest of time, it would only ever go here and it would never go to the 5 seconds one. But if while we're here, we change this to 1, then look at that. It always goes here. It always beats the one that goes to 3, okay? There's all sorts of things about how actions execute here. The general rule of thumb is that it goes top to bottom, so whatever you put first up here is gonna start running first, second, third, blah, blah, blah. But your computer runs them all as fast as it can, so if there's anything that is running every frame, remember when I did that int add, and this was running every frame, it'll keep running as well. So it's like my favorite number, let's add 2 to it, or let's add 1 or whatever. This is still running right now, see it? It's still running, it's still running. Okay, you should learn about the action update order. That's definitely something to look into. But generally just remember it's top to bottom, and if it's every frame, then it's kind of, it doesn't count in that order. It's just gonna constantly be running. Whichever thing fulfills its duty first, right? Whether it's a wait or whatever, that's what's gonna send the event. Okay, so let's do another thing. I'm actually going to clear this FSM, and I'm gonna add another one. Okay, and in here, I'm gonna put in a switch action. There's a lot of different types of switch actions. We have a num switch, float switch, state switch, game object tag switch, int switch, string switch. So I'm gonna put in a string switch. And a switch all it does is it looks at a variable you have, and then it sends an event based on that variable. So the amount of string switches, we can have like 3, right? And you can see that same thing with this int one. We have 3, and it's like, for our string one, what we'll do is we'll say like, make a new variable called person. And we're gonna compare the string John, Jim, and Joan, okay? And John will send the event, John was here. And Jim will send the event, Jim was here. And Joan will send the event, Joan was here. Okay, and we'll add each of these transitions, okay? And each of these will go to their own state, okay? So this one will be John, and this one will be Jim, and this one will be Joan. Okay, so all this is gonna do, let me get rid of this int switch, you already saw it's the same. So all it's gonna do is get to look at this person string, and whichever one of these matches it, it's gonna send there. So if I go to variables and person, I'm gonna call this value John, okay? So it should send to this state. So let's press play. Boom, there you go. And I'm gonna go to variables and I'm gonna change this to Jim. And by the way, a quick way to test things is by resetting the FSM, which you could easily do by just turning it on and off. So turning it off and then on again. So I'm gonna go off and then on. And look, it reset and now it's at Jim because we set Jim. All right, so you can see right here, the person variable is Jim. So it sent Jim was here, which leads to this state. So actions can also send events based off of information in them, based off of the values of a variable. So you could be like, hey variable, what is your value? Okay, we'll do this instead. Kind of like health in video games is a common one, is like, is your health 0? If so, then you're dead and it'll go to like a dead state. But if it's not 0, then you're still alive and don't do anything. Last category of actions I want to show you. We're gonna get rid of this again. We're gonna go new FSM and we're going to add in a get key. We're gonna be running every frame and we're gonna store the results in a new variable called is pressed. Okay, so right now it's false because a key is not currently pressed, and we have to specify the key, by the way. So I'm gonna say the space bar. Okay, so when space is pressed, this should show true, but if it's not, then it should show false. So when I press play, okay, it says false, but hopefully you can hear my key when I press it. And there you go, it's true. And I let go, and it's false. True, false. All right, so that's get key. There's also get key down and get key up. This one is only ever listening for the sort of actual down motion of you pressing it, and get key up is the one that's looking for the actual up motion. So like releasing a key, it's only looking, so these two only look for those specific moments. It's not just a binary state of whether or not it's pressed. It's looking for specifically the down motion, and this one specifically for that up motion, those little fraction of a second moments. So I'm gonna get rid of this one, I'm gonna get rid of this one. We're looking for key down. So we're only looking for when somebody presses the key down, that moment they press it, okay? And the key is, we'll do space again. And this time, instead of just storing it into a bool variable of true or false, we're gonna send an event, new event, pressed. Okay, so we'll add that transition. And there we go. So this first state is not pressed, that's what we're naming it, and this second one is pressed. Let's play it. Okay, so it's not pressed, right? Still here. Nothing's happening, nothing's happening, nothing's happening. I'm gonna hit space. Ready, go. And there we go, goes to it. Big surprise, all right? So great. Now the other thing is we get to put get key up in here, and we can say that get key up is also looking for space, and this one will send in the event not pressed, okay? And it'll send back like that. And I'm gonna play this, okay? So when I press it, I'm still holding it. I'm still holding space down right now, and it stays in there. But when I let go of it, it goes back to that first state. Pressing and holding, there we go. And if I just tap it, you can see it just kind of goes to that state really quick, but comes back. Okay, that's the basics of input. That's basically how everything works, is get key up and get key down, or get key. Now the thing is, get key is explicitly picking from this huge list of all the keys on a keyboard, right? Now, depending on what your project is, this might be okay, but more often than not, you probably want actions that let you dynamically change these. So for example, we also have get button, and this makes use of Unity's input axes. That's their sort of input control scheme. Okay, so you can do the same thing with these get button. It's the same idea. Get button down, get button up. It's just like get key down, get key up. Again, also works with mouse buttons, right? And lets you specify which mouse, whether it's like left or right or the middle click. Okay, so these are all, basically the idea is the same, right? Another thing is too, also remember that the get button actions, they will change if you're using Unity's new input system. They'll look a little different from this. So if you're using Unity's new input system, it'll ask you for those input system files. It'll let you specify it, so that way you can specify control schemes. And there's also this, Rewired, which is an asset on the asset store that makes input amazingly easy and super customizable. So you can have all these different interfaces, like game pads and touchscreens and joysticks and all that sort of stuff. And generally just a lot of other cool stuff about it. It's really awesome. It's been around for many years. It's sort of like the tried and true go-to asset for input. I use it for plenty of things. Can't recommend it enough. And they have PlayMaker support. Okay, so this comes with a whole package of actions that look just like the actions in here. Rewired has its own get up, and get down actions, and many more too, that actually make input crazy customizable with just single actions. Just remember, there's all sorts of different ways to get the same type of inputs from different systems in PlayMaker. Okay, now the last thing I really want to show you is that when you're building projects, remember I told you that you can make things 3D or you can make things 2D, and it doesn't really matter. Well, check it out. So we're in this 3D world right now, right? Up here, there's a 2D button. I'm gonna hit it. Now we're in 2D viewing mode. Okay, now this cube, right, with it selected, we have our box collider, right? Now I could just remove this component and add a component and type in 2D collider, and now you have all these different colliders that are for shapes instead. So there's box collider 2D, capsule collider 2D, circle collider 2D, right? Circle instead of sphere, you know? So if I put box collider 2D on this, now it has this collider. And you'll see that if I go out of 2D mode, look at it's flat. You see this collider? It's just in 2D space. Okay, so generally speaking, when you're making a 2D or a 3D project, the only thing it's really doing is by default making this little button on instead of off, and like a handful of other things. And it might make your main camera, it might change its projection from perspective to orthographic. So you can see over here our game view changed. It changed a little bit. You can see this right here. Like perspective is like that. So you can see like the depth of these platforms, whereas orthographic flattens space out. That's more like a 2D thing. Because, you know, some games that are built in 2D, they might use 3D objects, but the camera is rendering things in this orthographic sort of 2D mode. Those are generally the ideas behind it. And so same things with actions. You have a bunch of actions in here that, like, remember I was showing you, like, so you have like collision actions. Remember I was telling you using colliders earlier, whether or not things are touching each other, you can get collision info, right? This would be the one that you use for 3D objects, and then get collision 2D info is the action that you'd be using for 2D objects. So on this thing, you know, you might have this action on it. But if it was a 3D object, you would have this one, okay? And they just work a little differently. But yeah, so in your actions, just you could type 2D and it'll show you all the things that are specific to 2D, which usually means that they're using vector 2s instead of vector 3s, and there's a couple of just fundamental things, programmatically speaking, that need to be addressed. So yeah, you can just find them by searching 2D. All right, now let's say you built a game, right? You built out your game and you kind of figure out how all this shit works, and then you come up here to File, and then you go to Build Settings, and Build Settings is what's gonna let you save your game as like a file to be played. Or it's like a few files. But yeah, so what it asks of you up here is to first put in the scenes that are going to be rendered. So all this stuff right here, everything we've been working on, up here in the hierarchy, you can see up here it says sample scene. This is the scene we've been working in. So if you go over to project, when we first made this, right now there's a scenes folder, and this sample scene is right here, right? So if I just shrink this down, sample scene file. You can also right click and go create new scene and call this, like, I don't know, like the main menu screen. Sometimes people separate their scenes into like level 1 or level 2, etc., etc. And if you're making like a huge open world game, you might even partition your whole open world into like segments of the map. So you'd have it like named by like A1, and that's like the first corner. The very edge of the corner would be like Z9 or something. Scenes are sort of like this space loaded one at a time. So like if I save all this right now, right, this is our sample scene, but if I go to the main menu scene, it loads that, and look, there's nothing in here. Our hierarchy changes. This is, all that stuff isn't in here. But if I load this sample scene, I don't want to save any changes I made to this main menu scene. No, thank you. If I load the sample scene, now you see all our stuff is back here, right? This is everything we were working on. Okay, so these are scenes. So when you're building out a game, it lets you choose which scene. So I'll want my main menu, and I'll want my level 1, okay? And let's get rid of sample scene. We'll remove selection. And main menu's first, so that'll be the first thing that gets loaded when somebody starts the game. This scene loads first because it's the top of the list. And then everything after that needs to be programmatically loaded, and that's where level 1 will come in or whatever. And over here you have the different platforms. It's self-explanatory, you know, Windows, Mac, Linux, whatever you're on, this will be the default, and you just hit build and it'll make it. You really don't need to be changing anything here just to see how something runs. If you're trying to put something in a browser, you could change this to WebGL, but first you need to install the module. So you just hit this little install with Unity Hub and it'll start installing it. And then when it's ready, it'll switch to it, but be warned, it's switching to this and it kind of takes a minute to switch to it, and it'll only be able to build out in WebGL until you switch back to this, which will take, again, like a few minutes or however long. Or last time I checked, I remember it being kind of lengthy every time you switch back and forth between the platform. Yeah, but then after that, you just hit build, or you can hit build and run. By the way, when you hit build, it's going to ask you where you want to build it out to. I would not build it out to the folder of the game itself. I would specify some other folder. A lot of the times what I like doing is putting a folder on my desktop that I might, you know, create a new folder called like game builds or something like that. And that way I can come in here and select this folder, make a few different versions so I could build it out several times just in case something didn't work on the last build or whatever. Okay, and then when you hit that, it'll just build out, and then you'll see that file in there, and there'll be an executable, there'll be an application in there that you can just double click and run like any other application on your computer, and that'll be your game. With that broad overview, there's so much more to making games in Unity. There's just so much more, especially since it's multidisciplinary, right? Like this whole modeling thing and materials and all that stuff. There's like, and then sound design and all this sort of stuff, right? There's all this sort of stuff. But to navigate the bare bones basic and to start problem solving on your own, I think everything I just gave you is generally a really good starting point to get the broadest, sort of most general idea of how you might be designing your own games in Unity with PlayMaker.